All right, let's just dive right into this explainer because today we are unraveling a massively complex 40-year shadow war. We're talking about three nations whose strategic calculations have totally shaped the modern Middle East. It's a story of an undeclared conflict, one driven by intense ideology, high-stakes strategy, and some really deep-seated historical trauma. Now, you kind of have to wrap your head around this mind-bending irony. In the 1970s, Iran was the absolute cornerstone of American and Israeli influence in the region. Obviously, that sharply contrasts with the intense, existential hostility we see today. Back then, the US actually saw Iran as its most important partner outside of Europe, and Israel viewed them as a natural, vital ally. So how on earth did we go from that to the brink of total war? To understand how we got here, we're going to trace this constant action-reaction cycle through 5 defining chapters. From allies to enemies, the proxy war begins, the axis of resistance, the axis of evil, and finally, the nuclear deal standoff. Chapter 1. From allies to enemies. Let's look at how an incredibly tight alliance just unraveled almost overnight. For decades, Washington and Tel Aviv viewed the Shah's Iran as this crucial partner against the Soviet Union. By 1977, Israel and Iran even executed a massive $1.2 billion arms deal. They were practically inseparable, but both nations had a huge blind spot. They completely underestimated the anti-imperialist anger that was bubbling right under the surface. They missed the movement that fueled the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which ended with Ayatollah Khomeini returning from exile to a welcoming crowd of literally millions of people. Khomeini wasted absolutely no time. He consolidated his new regime by aggressively severing all Western ties. The Israeli diplomatic mission wasn't just closed down, it was sacked, devastated, and immediately handed right over to the PLO. And then, of course, the big one. 52 American diplomats were taken hostage by students for 444 days. Khomeini basically used this hostage crisis as the founding myth of his new republic. It left a permanent scar on U.S.-Iran relations, and essentially, the whole geopolitical board was reset. Which brings us to Chapter 2, the proxy war begins. Moving into the 1980s, the theater of this new conflict dramatically shifted away from Iran itself and directly into the civil war in Lebanon. This right here is a textbook strategic calculation. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to push out the PLO, but in doing so, their military occupation inadvertently alienated the local Lebanese Shiite community, who had honestly lived pretty quietly in the south up until then. This created the perfect opening. Sensing an opportunity to strike at Israel, Iran sent its elite Revolutionary Guards straight to the Bekaa Valley to organize, arm, and fund this newly angered Shiite resistance. And that resistance? Well, that became Hezbollah. But you really have to understand Hezbollah is more than just a militia. It was a counter-society, perfectly constructed by Iran. A child goes to a Hezbollah daycare, then a Hezbollah school, joins the Hezbollah scouts, and eventually joins the organization itself. It was designed by Tehran from the ground up to serve as strategic depth, basically a powerful tool to strike at Israel without ever engaging in direct state-to-state warfare. Now, this grim number, 241, represents the U.S. Marines killed in an October 1983 Beirut suicide bombing. It was a massive 2-ton bomb. This was a totally unprecedented tactic of martyrdom in the region, initiated by Hezbollah with Iranian backing. And it forced both the U.S. and Israeli militaries into a harsh realization. They were no longer fighting a conventional war. They were fighting a deadly shadow war. All right, Chapter 3, the axis of resistance. By the early 90s, the battlefield expanded from the war-torn streets of Lebanon to the polished halls of international diplomacy. The key takeaway here is really the power of isolation. After the Gulf War, the U.S. tried to build a new Middle East order with the 1991 Madrid Conference, an Arab-Israeli peace initiative that purposely completely excluded Iran. The hangover from the hostage crisis was just still too strong. So how did Tehran respond? Well, Ayatollah Khamenei organized his own summit 2 weeks prior, the Tehran Conference, gathering around 60 anti-Western groups to firmly reject the U.S. peace process. Iran essentially weaponized its isolation. Supreme Leader Khamenei created what became known as the axis of resistance. His logic was pretty simple. If America wouldn't give Iran a seat at the diplomatic table, Iran would create enough regional instability that they simply could not be ignored. So, they started heavily incentivizing and funding groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad to actively derail the peace process. This chilling sequence of events shows how targeted strikes escalated into global shadow warfare. Early 1992, Israel assassinates Hezbollah's leader, Abbas al-Musawi. From a pure intelligence perspective, Israel saw it as a massive success. But strategically, it was an absolute disaster. Just 1 month later, retaliation struck halfway across the world when a devastating car bomb destroyed the Israeli embassy in Argentina, killing 28 people. It perfectly illustrates how tactical victories in the shadow war often carry these disastrous, unforeseen consequences.
Moving on to Chapter 4, The Axis of Evil. Let's turn to the dawn of the 21st century, where the shock of 9/11 briefly aligned Iranian and American interests before, well, tearing them apart all over again.
It is truly surprising to learn that right after 9/11, Iran and the U.S. were briefly on the same side. Both nations shared a deep, historical animosity toward the Taliban. Get this, Iran's Revolutionary Guard quietly but actively assisted U.S. forces in toppling the regime. Iranian diplomat Mohammad Zarif even helped the U.S. draft the agreement for the new interim Afghan government. Tehran did all of this hoping their cooperation would finally earn them a spot back in the global community and an end to those brutal economic sanctions. But instead of a reward, Iran received what amounted to a rhetorical slap in the face. In 2002, President George W. Bush labeled Iran part of an axis of evil. For Iranian leadership, this was their worst nightmare realized. It confirmed their deepest fears that, regardless of how much they cooperated, Washington was really only interested in regime change. Which brings us to one of the most astonishing moments of this explainer. In 2003, feeling the intense heat of U.S. troops right on its borders, Tehran sent a fax via a Swiss diplomat. It was essentially a grand bargain. Iran practically offered to disarm Hezbollah and allow full nuclear transparency. In return, they just wanted sanctions lifted and regime recognition. But, riding high on the momentum of the rapid Iraq invasion, the Bush administration completely ignored it. They missed what was perhaps the greatest opportunity to reset relations in modern history. Chapter 5. The Nuclear Deal Standoff. Feeling threatened and completely dismissed, Iran drastically accelerated its uranium enrichment program, bringing us to the most dangerous standoff yet. This period marked a massive diplomatic push by the Obama administration. Recognizing the absolutely catastrophic risk of a nuclear-armed Iran, Obama shifted tactics. He initiated secret talks in 2012 to prevent a nuclear Iran without having to start another war. But, as you can imagine, this move caused deep, profound alarm over in Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu's unprecedented speech to the U.S. Congress in 2015 really highlights Israel's existential dread. From their perspective, compromising with a regime that actively funds proxies calling for their total destruction wasn't just bad policy, it was a fatal miscalculation. They firmly believed that true security could never come from a piece of paper signed with Tehran. Despite that intense pushback, the 2015 nuclear agreement was signed. And what's fascinating is that it was negotiated for Iran by Mohammad Zarif, literally the exact same diplomat who helped the U.S. in Afghanistan back in 2001. For a brief moment, this historic agreement really seemed like a beacon of hope. It looked like a potential end to isolation that could finally integrate Iran into the global community, all while keeping their nuclear ambitions strictly in check. But as we've seen throughout this whole explainer, peace is incredibly fragile in this shadow war. In 2018, President Trump officially withdrew the United States from the deal and immediately reimposed those crippling sanctions. The diplomatic bridges were burned overnight, and that 40-year cycle of distrust, animosity, and proxy confrontation was completely reset, bringing all the old hostilities roaring right back to life. So as we wrap this up, I really want to leave you with a provocative thought. We've just traced 40 years of missed opportunities, tragic miscalculations, and an unending cycle of action and retaliation. Now, in an undeclared shadow war driven by deep ideology and existential fear, what happens next? With the diplomatic guardrails completely gone, what sparks the fire that finally burns the whole chessboard down? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning.